Indeed, it is remarkable that in spite of COVID-19, the entire world joined in honoring the genius musician and humanist Ludwig van Beethoven during the 2020 year. We are pleased and honored to join to prepare this special concert under the auspices of the German American Heritage Foundation, sharing some of Beethoven's most inspiring compositions, which have also served as catalysts for promoting human dignity, freedom, and justice, as well as manifested his immense will and determination for overcoming even most severe handicaps to serve humanity through the arts. Prior to sharing a selection of Beethoven's great composition, let us share with you some of our personal experience of Beethoven, the man and the great genius.
I think my first recollections of Beethoven's music stemmed from my childhood when my mother would be performing and practicing his cello sonatas. There is one in particular, the A major sonata, number 3, that was particularly beautiful. So optimistic and full of joy, and that opening by the cello solo was something that really stuck in my ears. And many years later, when I had the opportunity to play it with my sister and with my mother, it had this sense of familiarity because I had grown up with it, and the sense of true joy as I experienced it as a performer.
My earliest recollections of Beethoven's music, like many young people, is from Disney's Fantasia. As I listened to his 6th symphony, the Pastoral, it was beautifully reflected and portrayed by the animation, and I think an emotional feeling was just one of joy and jubilant celebration, just like the 250th anniversary that we're celebrating this year, coupled with the extreme contrasts and strong emotions of Beethoven's music.
Definitely Fantasia, the film. I watched it hundreds of times, with the hippos and tutus and ponies with wings. I mean, I didn't know if they were centaurs or Pegasus or whatever, but the music was amazing, and I just loved it. And the part with Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony had me dancing around the room every single time.
In response to your question, I may not really respond in a very 2x2 way. Usually, people meet composers or writers by listening or reading their works or studying them in a systematic way through schooling. I have not been educated as a musician. However, I grew up in a family where music played a very important role, and there was no distinction between classical and popular music. There was only an emphasis on good music, music which would convey some meaning, some inspiration, and some motivation for good action. Every celebration at home, every birthday or name's day or Christmas or Easter was connected with music, both at home and at church and at society at large. For instance, when celebrating birthday, my mother hired a musician who came to serenade under the window early in the morning to play music, including music which later turned out to be Beethoven's music. And I heard this music also in the bakery where 70 men every morning had to listen to this music. My grandfather played it. Ta-ta-ta-ta, ta-ta-ta-ta. And one day I asked him, what is it all about? And he said, well, music has to inspire. And this man who composed it, his name was Beethoven, and he gave me the whole story. I was very inspired, and later on learning about the desire to bring to reality justice, equality, and respect. I was amazed by this.
In my nearly 50 years of being a concert artist, and nearly as many as an educator, I had many encounters with Beethoven's music, which made me reflect on the uniqueness of his music. My first encounters came, of course, through listening to recordings and realizing that his music is very different and sometimes can be difficult to understand because it is very abstract. My teachers probably felt the same way because the first time I was assigned a work by Beethoven was when I was a student in the Chopin Academy of Music in Warsaw. During that time, I was selected to participate in the International Pablo Casals competition. The mandatory piece in the second round was Sonata No. 4 in C major by Beethoven. Basically, in the very sophisticated musical environment in which I grew up and was educated, Beethoven was so highly revered that his music was typically only performed by very mature musicians. Performing Beethoven was truly a pinnacle which not everyone could reach.
Yeah, the first work that I learned by Beethoven was his Spring Sonata. So this is Sonata number 5 for violin and piano. Or if you look at the music, actually piano and violin. And it is a fantastic example of the emotional content and musical content that you will find in Beethoven, the stark contrasts between beautiful singing melodies with more bombastic surprises of dynamics, suddenly forte and then without warning piano, or vice versa. And it was an excellent vehicle to help push my playing to the next level. Beethoven can be quoted as once saying that he doesn't care about the difficulties that a certain violinist was experiencing with one of his works. He only cares about the music which he's trying to compose and communicate. And I think often we will find in Beethoven's work certain difficulties because they weren't necessarily conceived as violinistic works, but rather purely musical works. And in addition to that, certain awkwardness that can happen because of that, I think the sudden, surprising nature of his music can take not only the listener by surprise, but sometimes the performer by surprise as well, until they really become intimately familiar with the music.
As a teen, I studied several of Beethoven's piano sonatas. The first one was Opus 14, number 2 in G major, and I remember my teacher working through each movement with me with great attention to detail, very specific about the articulations and the dynamics in a way that we really worked through with a thoroughness that was unlike much of the other music I had studied before then. When I was 15 years old, I was invited to give a recital at the Beethoven House in Bonn. And I still remember that performance being in this rather humble building that is now, of course, also a museum, but has a small concert hall, and sharing the program, of course, with works of Beethoven, but others as well. And then touring the museum, seeing the manuscripts, learning more about his life, about Beethoven, both the musician and the composer, but also Beethoven, the person.
During my freshman year at Towson University, one of the professors and 2 guest artists performed with the orchestra as soloists in Beethoven's Triple Concerto, and I was in the orchestra accompanying them. Well, just a year later, when I was 16, I was on the stage as soloist in this same concerto. This work has multiple technical difficulties for the cello and is often nicknamed Beethoven's Cello Concerto. And it was crazy that this was the first solo work that I learned by Beethoven, right? I actually still look back on the recordings from these performances with pride.
These days, I spend a lot of my time working with young musicians. I have a passion for teaching and for sharing the music that has been a very huge part of my life with them. And very often I get a request from one of my students to play Für Elise. It's a piece that is so familiar to people around the world, to people who don't even follow classical music, and the kids all want to play it. Now, of course, because it's such a familiar piece, I want to make sure that they do it justice. And so we work and work and work on it, and eventually get it to a place that I would consider that is a decent performance of it. It's hard for a kid to have the attention to detail that it requires. Usually that's the first piece by Beethoven that they play, and maybe the last one for a little while, since most of the other works that he has wrote outside of a couple of bagatelles and sonatinas are really quite advanced and take some time and maturity before they can successfully take them on.
During my studies at the Jacobs School of Music for my undergrad and master's degrees, I was fortunate enough to perform many great orchestral works. Among those, almost every Beethoven symphony. One distinct rehearsal I remember where I was really quite tired because I had stayed up all night to study for a test and finish a paper, and just not having a great day. But then we sat down to play through Beethoven's Third Symphony, the Eroica, and I remember telling myself that everything in the world could be going badly, but when you play Beethoven's symphony, you feel fantastic and nothing else matters.
My favorite work by far is his Triple Concerto, which I performed many times, including in China in celebration of the 2008 Olympics. In this work, the cello is highlighted as the most important of the soloists, and for this reason, it is jokingly referred to as Beethoven's Cello Concerto. It is an uplifting and powerful work.
The music itself is powerful and majestic and triumphant and moving, and then together with other soloists, and of course in our case as siblings, but also with a conductor and with an orchestra, and all working together as one unit to create this beautiful, beautiful harmony together. There's nothing in the world like that.
If you finish your day with the Sixth Symphony, it has a very relaxing feel towards the end, which helps soothe you at the end of your workday, and then start your day with the Seventh Symphony, and you'll find that that really energizes the beginning of your day.
As a composer, it absolutely astounds me what Beethoven was able to accomplish. I can say that for me, it is a tedious and labor-intensive experience to create something, to come up with a germ of an idea, and then to elaborate it and to prepare it and work through it and create something that I feel satisfied with. I think most composers and musicians really struggle with finding that balance between pursuing their creative ideas and feeling like they have done it in a way that is worthy of sharing with others. And Beethoven had these additional challenges. One, of course, with his deafness. I cannot even imagine how much more challenging it would be if I could not hear what I'm doing. I always sit at the piano and I work through my ideas. Sound is what inspires me. So the inability to hear, much less working with an entire symphony or chorus of perspective ideas, is something that I can't fathom. But then you add in his desire for really taking something to its ultimate possibility and expanding the form and the concept in a way that really blows out of the water anything that had come before him in terms of the size and the dimensions and the instrumentation, and it's phenomenal.
Years later, I traveled to other countries of Europe, and coming, for instance, to Vienna. There were streets, there were museums, there was a lot of music played in different concert halls, music by Beethoven. I attended some of the concerts. I also saw his great monument at the Central Friedhof, and a very simple inscription, Ludwig van Beethoven. Returning home, I went to a town called Oberglogau, where Beethoven spent few weeks during his visit at that time Germany and now Poland. And while visiting the castle where he lived, a night guard is said, "This man really taught us how to respect other people." When taking this into consideration, I was reading some of the books about Beethoven, and I saw that virtually everybody expressed different perspectives and often repeated uncritically things that he was a very moody, that he was not respectful of others, that he was practically turning the social, religious order upside down. Well, on the occasion of the 250th birthday, it helps to remember the old maxim that creative geniuses are usually difficult to categorize neatly, as their originality prevents them from conforming with commonly held definitions and beliefs. Indeed, Beethoven was, for instance, raised in a Catholic family. However, we can read that he was either an atheist or that he was a theist and so on. That had nothing to do with Christianity, especially with church. It's true that he did not attend regularly Sunday events. It is true that he was practically seeing God everywhere. And when we read the most comprehensive and most competent source about Beethoven, it is the compilation of his statements, of his diary, of his letters. And here we can see who really Beethoven was. He had a high respect for the great creator and said, God is everywhere. And when he loved to go into nature, he practically respect nature as a revelation of the creator. And when composing music, he expressed it. There's been a lot of discussion about, for instance, Missa Solemnis. Many musicologists try to convey the message that this is not a religious music, that this is practically only written to please the Archduke, the Archbishop and Cardinal of Olomouc. Beethoven himself said that he spent over 1 year studying church music, and he was impressed not only by the text of the Mass, but also by the music which was conveyed from Palestrina and others. And he now incorporated some of the elements, but most of all he wanted to express himself in an homage to the Almighty omnipresence and to the loving God. Some musicologists say, well, it was not intended to be performed at church. Beethoven indeed presented it for a celebration, a special celebration at church. However, he also said that this music can be performed everywhere, because God is everywhere. And he even had organized concert where he said these great hymns for like the Kyrie and Gloria separately. And most important, when asking why did he write it, he said, well, not only to inspire musicians, the singers, but to implant religious feelings into the listeners, and permanent religious feelings. So what can be better in a service and in using music to inspire people? He did it also in political matter and other. And here is the greatness, that not by words, but by deeds. Now Beethoven, doing all his wonderful work, also had a lot of obstacles. We know the history of his family, the trouble with his nephew, the trouble with his sister-in-law, with some of the sponsors, but he never gave up. Sometimes he confronted, he went to court, he lost or he won. He always went forward and he said, finally, I have to take the judgment and the decision of the Almighty, because with time is passing, eternity remains. In speaking about eternity, here comes the day of his death. Friends are gathered around, and Beethoven in the court bring in the priest for the last rites. And again, according to the eyewitnesses, he expressed great gratitude. And we said at the end, friends, enjoy, the comedy ended. It doesn't relate the comedy of the rites. He considered life as a great scenes, which is a temporary event, because he said eternity matters. The comedy finished, but he was looking forward, and in his letters expressed it, to the eternity, where he will meet face to face the Almighty, the Creator, the loving Father. And interesting that his most important works were created in the time when he was almost totally deaf. And we look into Missa Solemnis, and we look into the Ninth Symphony. When was it created? 2 years or 3 years before his death. He was really under great suffering, but here it realized that through aspirate are too difficult to the stars. And he said, this is the way I want to serve people. Therefore, in conclusion, Beethoven is understood in various perspectives, and there are many opinions. But I wholeheartedly recommend to go and read and reread his diary, his letters, and most important, listen deeply to his music without any prejudice, because his music leads us to the Creator and leads us to people with justice, brotherhood, and peace.
Happy birthday, Beethoven!